Mark Pendergrass, author of Uncommon Grounds, The History of Coffee and How It Transformed Our World. In the back of the book, you run a number, or in your book, 800 GO, G-O, Brit, B-R-I-T-T. Why did you do that? Why'd you pass that on to the audience?
Well, you know, I'm somebody who believes in telling people how to get at things if I talk about them. For instance, I also ran the fax number of the roaster, the Polanyi roaster guy, where you can, for $3, buy this aluminum pie plate that has holes punched in it, and you can roast your own coffee. So I'm just trying to be user-friendly, basically. What you're referring to is Cafe Brit, which is a roaster in Costa Rica. And I ended the book with him fairly deliberately because, you know, this is going to be a little bit of a long answer to your question, but coffee beans are grown in the tropics in relatively poor countries. And then the beans, once they're processed, the green beans they're called, before they're roasted, I don't think most people have seen them, but they look like little peanuts. They're kind of greenish blue peanut-looking things. And when they're roasted, they blow up to twice their size, and they become the roasted coffee that you and I both know and love. Well, once it's roasted, a time bomb starts to tick. Once it's roasted, if oxygen gets to it, it stales it very quickly. And so ideally, coffee should be ground and brewed within a week or two of it being roasted. And that means that traditionally, the people who actually grow the coffee don't really make all that much money off of it. Certainly the people who harvest the coffee are very, very poor most of the time and get very little of the added value. And most of that value comes after it is roasted, when it's roasted. And I gave a plug deliberately to Cafe Brit because this guy is roasting it right there in Costa Rica, and he's adding money and value right there. And you can call this 800 number from North America, and you will actually reach someone in Costa Rica, and they will send you the coffee. And the way that they can keep it relatively fresh is, number one, they send it right out. And I'm not trying to give them a plug, but there's something called a one-way valve bag now where it will let air out but not in. And it really does help preserve the coffee for longer. And they use those kinds of bags. I wanted to encourage this sort of thing where we're not, in the developed world, the only ones who are making most of the money off of this. I tried very hard in the book not to take any kind of moralizing tone. I tried to just present the facts throughout 99% of the book. But in the final chapter, you know, after 400 or so pages, I figured I had earned the right to sort of have my say, and one of my says was just that.
Well, let me go back to the number. It's 800 G-O, Brit, B-R-I-T-T. If you call that number from the United States, do you pay tax?
Do you pay tax
somebody
just calling
ships you,
the number?
No. Somebody ships you these beans. Do you then pay tax on them? I mean, do you avoid tax this way?
No, I don't think you avoid tax. I think you have to pay tax on it.
Do you avoid paying the middle person all the way through the process money?
Yes.
And how many middle people are there in this game?
There are quite a few middle people in this game. Usually there's somebody who exports the coffee, and he has to deal with shippers and everything. And then there's somebody who imports the coffee, who's different from the exporter. Then there's, there are all kinds of people who test the beans along the way. There's the coffee exchange where the prices are set. There are the roasters. There are the retailers who sell the roasted beans, and there are the coffee houses that sell it brewed. There are the supermarkets, there are the warehouses. It's like, any other product, except for the fact that it's, coffee grows on volcanic mountainsides, usually, between about 3,000 and 6,000 feet high in the tropics, where the temperature never varies too much, out of the 70s. And 70 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So they're beautiful places, but they're quite remote. To just take it from the very beginning, the coffee tree actually is native to Ethiopia, and then it spread from Ethiopia across the Red Sea to Yemen, and the Arabs tried to keep a monopoly for quite some time. They finally lost that monopoly. There was an Indian pilgrim named Baba Budan who reputedly strapped 7 seeds to his stomach and took them to India. Then the Dutch got hold of some plants and planted them in Java. A French lieutenant got hold of a coffee tree and took it across the Atlantic to Martinique. And from that tree, most of the coffee that we drank from the Western Hemisphere descended. So it takes about 4 years for a seedling to grow to the point where it's a tree that's bearing enough berries to get the coffee. And a coffee berry is called a cherry. Usually it's red when it's ripe, although I've seen varieties when I was in Central America that were yellow. But most of them are red. And they have to be hand-picked. At least the best ones are hand-picked so that you avoid getting the ones that aren't quite ripe. Then they have to be processed immediately. The skin is taken off of them, what's called the mucilage, which is the sort of fruity part, which, by the way, tastes rather sweet if you chew it. That has to come off, and it doesn't want to come off the bean. It's sort of like very sticky. So in the wet process, they ferment it deliberately for a very strict, limited period of time, usually about 24 hours. And then it will wash off. And then the beans have to be very carefully dried. So there's a lot to the processing of the beans before they even get exported. Even once the mucilage is taken off, there's something called the parchment, which is the sort of thick skin that's on them. That has to be taken off. And then there's a little very thin tissue paper called the silver skin. And they try to get most of that off, but a lot of that turns into what's called chaff during the roasting process. So it's really a complicated business.
There's a lot that I want to ask you about, including the guy you found that drinks 50 cups of coffee a day. Where'd you find him?
Joe McBratney. He owns a wonderful restaurant on Staten Island. It's called the Kreischer Mansion, and I highly recommend his mussels. But I found him from a 20/20 show on television. It was a show on caffeine and on its addictive qualities. And they showed Joe, and on television, he appeared to be quite a calm person. And so I was intrigued. I thought, gee, somebody who drinks, it's the equivalent of 50 cups. By the way, I just mailed Joe a cup about this size as sort of a joke, because I found one, it's bigger than this, it's huge. And he drinks out of cups about this big, so it's the equivalent of 50 regular cups that he drinks. This is water, by the way.
And this is a network that spends most of its time talking about what government does and laws and all that. You mentioned caffeine. Has the government ever tried to ban caffeine in this country?
Well, it came close to it. In 1912, the government actually sued Coca-Cola in Chattanooga. It was a huge lawsuit. I wrote about this in a previous book, but I also wrote about it in this one. They went after caffeine in a big way. It was interesting. Around the turn of the last century, caffeine was extremely controversial, in large measure because of a fellow named C.W. Post that we might want to talk about in a little bit. I wrote a whole chapter about him and Postum. But there was a fellow named Harvey Wiley, who was the father of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. And Harvey Wiley hated Coca-Cola. Interestingly enough, he didn't hate coffee so much. He was opposed to anything he thought was unnatural. He thought that Coca-Cola was deliberately adding this drug and was selling it to children, and that's what bothered him the most. Whereas coffee was a natural constituent. But they had scientists on all sides of the issue debating this, and eventually Coca-Cola won on the lower courts, but then lost higher up, and they sort of did a settlement out of court. They agreed to reduce the amount of caffeine in Coca-Cola at that point.
Some quick basics. Where do you live?
Vermont, Essex Junction, Vermont.
You mentioned that Uncommon Grounds, the name of your book, is also the name of a coffee shop in Burlington, Vermont?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the picture of me in the back of the book was taken in that fine coffee house. There's another one owned by the same people in Saratoga Springs. There's another one that just opened up in Watertown, Massachusetts. When I went out on my book tour to Berkeley, California, there's a roastery out there, very fine roastery called Uncommon Grounds. They came, they gave me a T-shirt, they gave me some of their coffee, so I think there are Uncommon Grounds all over the country.
How long did you work on your book?
3 years.
What gave you the idea to do it?
Well, you know, I told you I'd written For God, Country, and Coca-Cola before this, and that book was about the same length. It was, you know, quite an interesting story about how a rather inessential product, you know, 99% sugar water, basically, became the world's most widely distributed product. And this is a similar kind of intriguing story. I like the paradox of the fact that this is just really, it's the pit of a berry of an obscure understory, shrub, tree, whatever you want to call it. Well, it's the second most valuable exported commodity on Earth after oil. Now think about that. That's amazing. And although, you know, if the whole world were deprived of coffee tomorrow, we would all have a gigantic withdrawal headache. But after a few days, we'd all be okay. We don't need coffee. It doesn't provide any nutrition to speak of. And yet, it's become central to our lives. As long ago as over 100 years ago, someone said, you know, this has become the indispensable beverage. And arguably, it changed the course of civilization in many ways, for the good and for the bad.
How many cups of coffee on average does an American drink every day?
I think it's a little over 1 now. It's not all that many. It's interesting. The per capita consumption of coffee actually peaked, if you do it in pounds per capita, in 1946, right after World War II, at about 20 pounds per person. And now it's about half that. It's about 10 pounds per person. So it's been declining ever since World War II. It is now leveled out. That's what the specialty industry has done. You know, we've sort of rediscovered quality coffee from origin now, and it's halted the decline, and it may begin to go up a little bit.
Why do the Finns drink the most coffee of anybody in the world?
That's a good question.
And how many more pounds a year per capita do they use over there in Finland than we do here in the United States?
I'd have to look it up. I don't remember exactly.
I remember the figure of 28 pounds a year.
Yeah, that's right.
Like that for Finns.
You've read it more recently than I. 28 pounds per capita, I think is correct. Well, it's awful cold up there, and the Scandinavians don't use any Robusta. They use only the best. There's two kinds of coffee bean. One is called Arabica, and one is Robusta. Up until 100 years ago, no one ever used anything but Arabica, and it's by far the superior type of coffee. What happened was there was something called Himalaya vastastrix, this otherwise known as the coffee leaf rust. It's a fungus which attacks coffee, and it wiped out the industry in the East Indies at